I have lots of questions today on, I want to take them deeper into the numismatic situation and why numismatic coins, the difference between that and bullion, because I've been looking at a lot of cool coins and understanding the values of them. Before we dive into that though, can you give us like a 5-minute or 2-minute or whatever minute summary you have of what is currently going on in the financial system of Federal Reserve notes and the economy, because it's crazy, man.
Yeah, it is. What's really disconcerting to me is the power that the Fed has now in its influence over the broad economic environment. It's really troubling to me. It's like Congress has abrogated its responsibility for sustaining a viable economy by dumping it basically on the Fed. So, where Congress deficit spends, and every time Congress spends money it doesn't have, it has to sell assets. It has to sell debt instruments to raise the gap between what it's bringing in revenue and what it's spending. And I think we all understand at this point that the government is spending a considerably larger amount than it's bringing in it. And every time it runs into that gap problem, I've spent more than I'm bringing in, to make up that difference, it turns to the Federal Reserve and just lets the Fed buy assets from the Treasury Department. But to do that, that means the Fed is printing money. And unfortunately, as a solution for Congress, that may be fine. But for you, me, and everybody else, it's kind of disconcerting, because it means that they're inflating our money every time Congress is spending more than it takes in. And on top of everything that we've deficit spent, we already had massive debts coming in before COVID, all the extended money that was spent during this COVID period, and every stimulus package, on top of which now the new government, our Biden administration, is now proposing a $3.5 trillion budget that can't be fiscally financed unless they significantly raise taxes. And, they're playing the political game, of course, and suggesting that, well, we'll only raise it on the ultra rich, or we'll raise corporate taxes, which is problematic because a lot of people have small businesses. That means it's much more expensive for them too. If they raise the corporate rate from 21 to 26%, that's 5 or 6% more of the profits that you normally would have been able to keep in your business. You're now going to have to fork over to a government because they can't control their spending habits. And I'm finding this very problematic, that our reliance on the Federal Reserve is so extensive that it means that if they make any kind of misstep, that we can experience some real knee jerks into the economy. So I'm a bit troubled by this.
Well, and so this has always been my question. So, and this is a little strange, because I remember back to the Ron Paul days of okay, we need to audit the Fed, we need to do this different thing. Ultimately, the Fed is technically an illegal organization. So I know that we technically owe the money back. Each individual has a debt back to the Federal Reserve. But if we didn't actually originally agree to it, I understand that Congress was involved, but let's just, what if we went with the idea that it was an illegal contract to begin with? How far can we take? And the reason I ask this is because, okay, $30 trillion. We're almost at a $30 trillion debt. That doesn't count unfunded liabilities. There has to be a line. Is a line crossed at 30 trillion? Is a line crossed at 35 trillion? At what point is the system just okay, we can't go any farther. You can't raise a debt ceiling anymore. The entire system's broken. The country is beyond, do you know what I mean by that? Where is the line?
Yeah, I've thought about that a lot. I remember when we first crossed into the $1 trillion level of debt, and people were panicked about that. And then people started looking more in terms of economic statistics. So instead of focusing on, let's say, the number in terms of how large the debt was, they kind of looked at it in relationship to how big is the economy, or, how fast is the economy growing, and can we sustain this kind of debt by simply increasing production? And at what point does that become problematic? When the estimates are that we're going to be spending so much money on the interest alone, on the carrying costs of our debt, that it's going to absorb, everything that the GDP produces. We get to a point where we hit unsustainable levels, But technically speaking, really nothing prevents us from continually adding to this massive debt. What begins to happen is that we have to start draining resources. So there are a limited number of ways that we can address the problem. We can print our way out of it, which is an easy solution. It's been suggested even by people like Judy Shelton, who's a brilliant economist, that the Federal Reserve theoretically, instead of only absorbing, let's say 25% of all that 31 trillion worth of debt on their balance sheet, what if they bought it all? What if the Fed just printed the money, paid off the entire debt of the country and said, okay, we're done. And now the Fed holds this monster amount of debt on its own balance sheet and takes the next 20 years to unwind it. All of these things are theoretically possible, but they all end up contributing to inflation because one way or the other, it requires the printing of massive amounts of money unless somehow we change that relationship between what the government spends and what it brings in, which they're trying to address by suggesting that we're going to propose a $3.5 trillion budget and we're going to pay for it. Guess what? You're going to have to pay more taxes so that we can do that. That is also something that the question of sustainability. How far will it go before the public is saying, we're effectively acting like slaves if we're turning over 30%, 40%? At what point of the money that you earn that has to be turned over to the government does it become so intrusive that we get a pushback? I find the problem with that is that there's political maneuvering back and forth, even though they want to raise the rates at which they charge taxes amongst people. The political argument will be, well, it's not you, it's somebody else that will pay for it. They always play that game. We all end up paying for it in the end. I don't want to hear it. There's no way out of this. And you wonder at one point the public might just step up and say, hey, wait a minute, we've had enough. I would like to keep some of the money I earn, and I don't want to have to finance a government because they can't control their spending, because they don't have to. It kind of reminds me of the situation with the banks when they could pawn off the mortgages. If a bank took your mortgage and said to you, you take out a mortgage from us, we will hold that mortgage till the end of its term, and you make your payments to us, and we'll be liable and responsible for that mortgage, they're going to be particularly careful about who they loan that money to. But if they can pawn it off, to Freddie and Fannie, government organizations that buy the debt, and the Federal Reserve is purchasing mortgage securities at still $40 billion a month, every month, month after month after month, encouraging banks to make these mortgage loans, the risk is limited. So we simply shift, the concern. And I think the government plays the same game. It knows it can run up deficits. It knows it can spend money it doesn't have because we have this backstop. We have this strange central bank system that affords the opportunity for them to say, okay, you spent this much more this year than you took in. Well, we'll buy that much in debt from the Treasury, and we'll simply print the money that we need to pay for it. How long can we do that? Honestly, we can keep that up indefinitely with a cost, and the cost comes in that weaker dollar. So, I think cost increases are going to be pretty substantial, and I think the inflation numbers, which have been very interesting, we're starting to see inflation numbers we haven't seen in years and years and years. The rate at which it's growing is becoming clearer, and we've gone from where the economists and the Treasury and the Federal Reserve were in denial. First it was there isn't inflation, and then when that became a hard pill to swallow, and they really couldn't keep that premise up anymore, they changed it to, okay, there is inflation, but it's what we call transitory. You're only seeing inflation now, but it's going to dissipate in a couple months. And then that argument kind of fell apart, and it looks like there's more sustaining inflation than they anticipated. Now they're shocked by the rate of inflation, and now they want to try to address it, and they're going to address it by, again, raising rates, slowing down their asset purchases. And the Fed is sort of stuck now in a really interesting kind of a corner in that there's a lot of political pressure for the Fed to try to slow down the amount of intervention, the amount of asset purchases it's making. And I wonder, what would the economy look like? What would the benchmark? The benchmark would be like the 10-year note. They consider that the benchmark. So it pays currently 1.3% interest. So that is, you take out a 10-year purchase of debt from the U.S. Treasury, you guarantee that you will hold it for 10 years, and they will pay you 1.3%. That 10-year note is basically the benchmark. Everything else sort of floats around it. And what would that rate really be if the Fed wasn't out there buying $120 billion a month in debt instruments? It certainly wouldn't be as low as 1.3%.
Right.
So we have a very artificial market. And I'm really, getting concerned because the gap between what we have and what we see in statistics and what's really happening in the underlying economy, those things are diverging. They're getting farther and farther apart. And I think it's going to result in higher inflation and higher prices across the board than a lot of people are prepared for.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. The price is going up. Also, the packaging of not only packaging, but the creation of products is shrinking. Like, you can go to the store and you actually see the product is smaller, it's less quantity, etc. They're making it look the same, but it's definitely not. And I think that's starting to wake people up of like, wait a second, something is strange here. There's something going on. And then I just checked. I checked my crypto numbers, and the crypto market is ranging between $2 and $2.3 trillion market cap right now. That's a pretty big market cap.
It's a huge market cap.
Yep, 2.3. It's at the high in the last on September 7th. It was at $2.3 trillion market cap, while the same in silver is at 2386 and 1803 for gold. I feel like, and I had someone tell me this the other day. They said an interesting word. They called it a parallel economy running. I feel like there's a parallel economy that is running. Have you heard about that at all?
Well, if you're talking about the concept that I'm laying out here is that we have reality on one side, and then we have what they're purporting on the other side. Yeah, I suppose you can look at it that way. And what I'm saying is that parallel lines stay together. There's no gap in them distance-wise. No matter how far out you draw them, they don't diverge any farther from each other. They're parallel. They stay the same. I don't believe that's what's happening. I think the gap between reality and what they're purporting is getting wider. And every once in a while, when that gap gets so large that they can no longer pretend that what they were saying is reality anymore, they have to adjust. And they have to adjust in a way that will be palatable. So they have to create another way of explaining the problem, or they have to come up with what they propose as what will be a solution. And right now the pressure is that the Fed should stop intervening in the economy as much as it is, because it's recovering, and we should let the natural environment take over. I don't think the economy is sustainable without Fed intervention. We've become too reliant on this system of the Fed backing up Congress. Now, if we stop the Fed from making these asset purchases, Congress would have to be much more adjusting to real world numbers. They would have to actually pay attention to the difference between what they bring in and what they spend, more like individual people do. I mean, you and I can't ignore that. We can't keep running money up on the credit card if we don't have the income to pay the bills when they come in. And if we run out of money on the credit card, we can't simply go to another credit card and use that to pay the first one off without increasing the revenue stream and keep playing that game indefinitely. We cannot do that. But Congress can, because behind Congress sits this enabler. So, it's like if you were a gambler and you kept spending money you didn't have, but you had a friend that kept loaning it to you, regardless of whether you won or lost. And you lost all your money, you go back to him, he'd loan you more. And you'd owe him that much plus whatever you spent before. And then you'd blow through whatever he gave you in the new money. And you continue to play that game. Well, that's great, as long as that enabler sits behind you and continues to pump money in your account. But when they decide that they've had enough and say, okay, you're out of control, you've never won, you're not going to win, I don't believe you can pay me back even the interest on the money you borrowed, let alone the principal, and I'm going to stop making the payment to you. You have to change your habits.
That's such a good way of putting it. And we have an enabler. That's such a good way of putting it.
That's what it is. We have an economic enabler. And, Congress understands this enough to know they're not really responsible to maintain a balanced economic environment. They don't have to keep a balanced budget. They don't even have to pretend to. They know that in the end, there is this monster behind them with unlimited amounts of money because it can print any amount it needs to in order to solve every problem that comes up. And the question becomes, how viable is that as an economic way of dealing with things? And what does that do for the average person? And unfortunately, the shortcut end of this conversation is that we end up printing our way out of these problems. We simply create all the money we need for all of the instruments of debt to sustain this economic activity. And that cost is that you and I spend more money buying the same goods and services. So, the box of Cheerios stays at $3.50, but like you said, maybe, it's a third smaller in size at the same price. So that's supposed to be something we're not noticing because the price stays the same. I mean, which is better? Keep the box the same size and raise the price, or keep the price the same and lower the amount.
Right. And that's why people are. It's interesting. Did you ever think that as many people would be going into gold and silver today as they were? Like, I think people are waking up to the fact that, I need something. Well, if you're waking up at all, but I need something to hedge against this. And gold and silver, even at what is it, $23.85 right now, an ounce of silver. You've been slammed. Like, you're getting phone calls, not just from new people. What are your people you've had for a long period of time saying?
Well, they've been adding and building on their positions, and a lot of them are worried they don't have enough. Some people are worried that they're going to get caught short because a lot of people worry about exogenous events that might come into play that, are going to accelerate the rate at which things are happening. So people are kind of troubled, even those that have been doing this for a long time. I've talked to very few, occasionally, someone who's been doing this for decades who says, okay, I think I'm there. I've got that percentage I think I should have. And that's pretty much how I've always looked at this. People shouldn't be putting all of their money into gold and silver coins or anything. They shouldn't be putting it into crypto. They shouldn't be putting it into the stock market. They shouldn't be putting it all into real estate. You need to be diversified into a multiple number of asset classes. This way, whatever should happen going forward, you're better off protected if you're diversified. And I think people are beginning to worry, particularly those that are entering that retirement phase. They're getting to that point where either they're hitting that age bracket or they're beginning to think about it. And what's very encouraging is actually a lot of younger people are thinking ahead, thinking about what life will be like 20 or 30 years from now. And what do they do now if they have a little extra money? How do they put it away? A couple of generations ago, there was the stuff the money under the mattress mentality. People who'd come out of the era where we had faced the Great Depression, those people that were Depression era, either directly or they were the children of Depression era families. They grew up with a complete, let's say, lack of faith in the standard banking system. And the idea was for them, I don't trust banks. I'm literally stuffing my money under the mattress. And you could almost get away with that in the 1950s, even the 1960s. Money would lose value, but very slowly. So 20 or 30 years later, when you hit that point at which you needed the money, you pulled it out from under the mattress and okay, you spent it. We can't do that anymore. No. Not only does it not make sense, but money is deteriorating much more quickly. It's only recent that the interest payments that you and I get if we deposit money is less than the actual inflation rate. That hasn't always been the case. Normally, the interest rates are higher than the rate of inflation, so that you're staying ahead of the curve, or at least even. You can earn out of a bank by depositing money and leaving it there pretty much enough to cover for whatever the amount of inflation would chip away at the value of the dollar. But now we are upside down. We have an environment where if you deposited money in your bank and said, I'll leave it there for a year, whether you buy it as a CD or leave it in an interest-bearing account, you can't even get 1% interest. And with that, we have a inflation rate, according to these are the government numbers, about 4.8 to 5.4% the increases now in inflation, which means that, let's say it's 5%, just as a ballpark figure, and you're only earning 1% in your bank. So 4% of your money is being stripped away from you every year you let it sit in your bank. Now, if you think about that over 10 years, well, that's a pretty significant amount of power to lose in buying power. So, how do people compensate for that? And it's because of these low interest payments and the fact that we're creating so much inflation that there is this new mentality for people to start looking into alternatives. Why are people looking at gold and silver? Why are they even looking at crypto? It's because there's no faith in the value of the US dollar, sustaining itself going forward, when people understand the basic fundamentals that the government will not slow down its deficit spending. If we had taken a more intelligent approach and slowed down the rate of deficit spending, again, the economy would have been a little rougher, but the real result of a better value in the dollar, would have ended up with people being able to have a dollar that didn't lose quite so much. And if you think the inflation rate is detrimental to your future wealth now, imagine if the inflation rate goes up another 2 or 3%, 4 or 5%. What if it doubles? At what point will it become so problematic that, we start to look like a third world country, and people are running to spend money they earn as fast as they can get it because it doesn't have any sustainable purchasing power. And it's very troubling when I talk to people who are trying to figure out what to do, who've come to realize that, the old plan, I buy stocks, I buy bonds, I put money in the bank, I'm conservative, I don't want to speculate, and that's my sustainable approach. Well, that plan just isn't functional anymore.
No, it makes sense. So people are investing when they come to the show, and I'm pulling one out right now. So I have some silver coins. Now, when it comes to investing, we have numismatics, we have things like bullion, we have, as they used to call it, junk silver. What are the differences between, is this considered bullion or is this considered numismatic?
Bullion.
Okay, that's bullion. I have numismatic,
right,
which is sitting in the house as well, which comes in a nice little plastic case and says what it is, and it's pretty cool, and it's older, etc. What is the difference between all of this? Because I do know they've talked about bullion, like if the government were to call something in. Can you give kind of a breakdown of the different types of gold and silvers that people will get?
Yeah, let's say we could say this too, but let's call it 3 tiers. All right. So the first would be the heavy numismatic stuff. Okay, now numismatics meaning something that has a greater value than merely its intrinsic content, and that would be anywhere from something with a slight premium over melt to those coins that are excessively rare. Like, I've been looking through coins in the last few hours this morning. There were a number of coins that ranged between $35,000 and $500,000 that were available to be acquired by long-term investors. So a $500,000 coin, the one that was available, for example, this morning, it's a $5 gold coin, goes back to 1800. Incredible mint condition.
A $5 gold coin worth $500,000?
Yeah, single coin worth $500,000. So
that's awesome.
More than a lot of people would ever spend even on a home.
Sure.
You'd have a single coin about, yay big. So it has probably, 0.48 $1,000 worth of gold content in it at most, and yet it carries a price of $500,000. So obviously then, is it the gold content that's reflected in that? It's not. That is a numismatic coin with excessively rare market value because it is extremely rare, it is extremely high quality, and it is unattainable. So even if you had $100 million, you still could only get one. You couldn't get 2 or 3 of them if you wanted them because they're not available. And it's a coin that was worth a fifth of what it is now, 15 or 20 years ago. It was a $100,000 coin. It became a $300,000. Now it's a $500,000, and it'll be $1 million coin in years to come. So there are those really wide-ended, really rare coins in the numismatic world. Now, the more common an older coin becomes, that premium begins to be reduced, and it gets a little closer and a little closer to its metal. Most of what we've been finding that has been most attractive to people in the last few years have been the areas of the gold and silver coins that don't carry a lot of premium over melt, just enough to separate themselves from the bullion world. And the reason they have that additional value is because of their limited supply. So that coin you held up is something that could have been produced 10 years ago. It could have been produced this year, and they could make it 10 years from now. And every one of them will be exactly the same. There's no additional value to it more than merely its melt content, although you will have to pay a premium over silver for it because everything costs a little bit more than its melt content these days. So there is that side of the market. The stuff that I find most palatable when it comes to protecting wealth also includes those pre-65 dimes, quarters, and half dollars. Now, in that case, we're not dealing with an excessively rare product. We're dealing with the most common of the fixed supply items. And they carry the smallest premiums over melt. In fact, in a lot of cases, the premium for the pre-64 dimes, quarters, and half dollars is less than what you're paying for a lot of modern bullion coins that are being produced. So there's an area where we have that second tier of metal. So it's something that is tied very closely to the price of silver and or gold, but doesn't carry a lot of additional value beyond its melt content. The third part of the market.
Go ahead.
The third part of the market is the strict bullion, and that would be like those bricks of 100-ounce bars of silver, 110-ounce bars of gold, or any item, round or square, it doesn't matter what shape it is, that is simply something that's punched out of the metal, but is not a legal currency coin of the United States government, something that was not issued with the intent to be used as money, and it only has the value of the metal itself. It'll never carry much of a premium, if anything at all, when you try to sell it. But the government has separated these things, and it deals with them differently. And what it has done is it's pushed everything into that bullion market under an umbrella. And that umbrella is the government regulation. The government has taken control of the bullion market, the same way it controls other commodities. And that regulation means a couple of things. First of all, it means you lose your financial privacy, meaning that if you were to take a 100-ounce bar of gold or silver and sell it, federal law now requires me as a dealer to report that sale to the Internal Revenue Service. That reporting includes taking your name, social security number, and address, and forwarding that to the IRS with the amount of the check that I wrote to you for the sale of that item. And that means that a 1099-B has been issued, and that's going to show up with the IRS's reporting, and that means that they're going to make sure that your tax return that year also carries that same information. Now, if I send a 1099-B that you've sold $10,000 worth of bullion and you don't report it on your tax return, and the IRS picks up on that discrepancy, you have a problem. You have a tax liability problem now that they will address aggressively. Now, the pre-64 coins, or those valuable numismatics, are excluded from the government regulations. Because they stand as constitutionally lawful money, they've been eliminated from that bullion umbrella. Therefore, you can buy the pre-65 dimes, quarters, half dollars, sell any quantity of them, and while you have a legal obligation to report any profits that you make, they don't rest that obligation on my shoulders. They don't make me file personal information. I never have to ask a client of mine for their social security number. I never have to file any forms with IRS. I never have to form government agencies of any of the transactions that people do. We are in a private portion of the industry. I like that. I don't like being forced to comply with government regulations. I've always found that kind of disconcerting personally, and I certainly find it that way as a business owner, that I don't want to have to, just provide private information that I think is really none of my business. They've gotten more strict recently. They've started to add to the regulatory nonsense all of the anti-money laundering rules, these AML rules, that now require the know your customer nonsense. So theoretically, I'm supposed to be able to justify that I'm aware that any money you spent came from a legitimate source. Not that I have any idea how I would ever know that, but this is the nonsense that they try to do. So those are basically the differences between, the bullion, the coins that are somewhat numismatic, that just barely have a little bit of value above melt, and then the extreme, rarity. Now, somebody who's buying an extremely rare coin, even a $20,000 or $30,000 coin, the rationale for that's pretty simple. They're buying something that is extremely scarce, and the belief is that how much demand do you need if there are a handful of coins out there to drive up the value of something that's that hard to find, when people have been after these things for long periods of time, if not hundreds of years, decades certainly. And the demand for rare coins of high quality is growing, as people see it as a great way to store large amounts of wealth in something that would appreciate over the years in value. It's somewhat similar to people that used to speculate and buy large numbers of properties in the real estate world. If you could buy 5 or 6 pieces of property, that might be a great way for you to put future wealth away. Real estate property, though, is a little more different in that most people don't buy the property, they buy the money. And, they take out a loan to buy the property. You have to pay taxes. You have real estate taxes and all sorts of property taxes and things, and maintenance, which is difficult. You might have to put a roof on a property. You might have to fix plumbing issues. Windows get broken, all things like that. None of those apply to rare coin. You buy a nice quality rare coin, you stick it away, forget about it. You don't need to do anything to it. You don't need to water it. You don't need to put it out in the sun and let it grow. It's not going to deteriorate. You're just going to stash it away and let it appreciate in value. So there's some interesting rationale to that. A lot of people would rather have larger quantities of lesser expensive items, not only because it makes them a little bit more comfortable, but it also gives them a lot more diversification and a little flexibility. Now, if you had a $50,000 coin and you needed $5,000, you can't trim off a little piece of it. It's an all or nothing kind of thing.
Right.
But if you have a bag of silver dimes and you need to raise a little money, you can literally sell one dime, 1 quarter at a time until you raise what you need. So there's a lot of flexibility involved. And, somebody buying a truly rare coin needs to be very long-term minded. They need to be thinking 10 years out, not 6 months or anything like that.
Right.
So sort of a different rationale. But again, there's a lot of ways to skin a cat. I'm a firm believer that any physical form of physical assets that one holds, it's got to be better than paper money. I mean, even if it's bullion, which I'm not a fan of, it's certainly still better than paper dollar.
Definitely.
When the dollar is being inflated so heavily. So
now,
that's basically what we're looking at, and the differences.
If they were to call in bullion, right? If they were to reclaim, do these fall under it as well, or does that not?
Yes.
That does.
Yeah. Anything that's not a coin of legal currency in the United States would be under that auspices of a government recall. Now the recall of gold that we saw in history in the United States was predicated in 1933 on a different rule, which was at that time the federal requirement that you couldn't print money that wasn't gold backed. Now imagine if Congress in 2021 could not allow the Federal Reserve to print money to buy these assets unless there was actually gold or silver somewhere supporting every dollar they used to make those purchases. How limited would the purchases be? They couldn't buy $4 trillion. In 2020, the Federal Reserve balance sheet was about $4 trillion. They're estimating by next year it's going to be $9 trillion. That's a $5 trillion increase since 2020 of the Fed's balance sheet. That is the most rapid increase in the Fed's balance sheet in its history since 1913. And the expansion of money in the economy, the amount of actual cash floating around, the M2 as they look at, which is the money supply, it's grown about 26% in less than a year and a half. And that's the largest increase in the supply of money since World War II. So we're seeing the impact of Congress being able to deficit spend without recourse. It has no limit because it knows that it has its enabler hanging out in the background saying, all right, you spent a couple trillion you didn't have, guess what? We'll buy some more assets from the Treasury and we'll simply print the money to buy those assets and everybody's happy. Are they? I don't think so.
It's crazy. Now, have you heard or do you know how much gold and silver there actually is out in circulation? Is there, obviously there's not enough to cover. I'm assuming in circulation is not enough to cover what we have in money supply. But is there any behind the scenes knowledge of that at all? Like, do we have gold?
Yeah. Well, the World Gold Council does a really good job of actually maintaining kind of a level of sort of watching the amount of gold that exists, how much has been mined, and how much the central banks hold. And, the Federal Reserve in New York has this vault, and it has all the storage of these monster numbers of gold bars that each country holds. And, the World Gold Council looks at that. And some people have done the math and said, if you took the amount of money in paper and you divided it by what's known to exist in gold on Earth, gold would be about $50,000 an ounce.
That's a nice chunk of money right there.
Yeah. So this is obviously why we don't back money with gold, because, we don't want to drive the price of gold through the roof like that. I've always thought of gold in a lot of different ways, but one of the ways I think about it is that it is sort of a mirror image of the US dollar, and it's sort of a warning, light. If the gold prices are climbing really rapidly, it's kind of an indicator that there's a fundamental flaw in the paper money world. And I say they, as in the government, especially the Federal Reserve, do an awful lot to try to keep gold from climbing, especially rapidly, because they don't want people to be concerned about the status of the dollar. Because if they don't get the relative strength and the relative support, then they have a big problem. They need to keep convincing people that everything's okay and that dollars are fine and no reason not to hold dollars, and you can keep investing in the stock market and nothing's wrong and everything's great. Things will continue. But this is why that little insidious snipping of value slowly works very well. It's the old froggy in the pot of boiling water routine.
Yep. Exactly.
We've heard that old analogy, and it works. I mean, it's a perfect metaphor because you drop a frog in a pot of boiling water, he hops right out. He's like, no way, this is no. But you put him in a pot of warm water, you slowly turn the heat up. The frog never sees what's coming. Sits in that water playing around and frolicking until suddenly he finds itself boiled to death and never knew what happened because it was slow. It was insidious. It was not really rapid and overwhelming. And this is the general way that we get away with this. Because honestly, if the public really took a hard look, and unfortunately you normally need long periods of time to see it, in our current economic environment with a 26% increase in money supply in a year and a half, and inflation running as high as it is now, price increases are becoming very clear. I don't think anybody hasn't noticed the cost of things going up. And people have, it's all anecdotal, but I've heard from people in just about every kind of business you could think of. And nobody has said to me, oh, my cost of my goods or whatever I buy has gone down.
It's all going up.
Going up. Everything's going up, and whatever industry people are in, they're paying more. And we haven't even addressed not only the manufacturing issues, but the supply chain problem of shipping, which hasn't really taken hold yet in terms of the cost increases. But, I'm expecting to see a rate of inflation continue to grow going forward the next few years to a point where, the Fed's going to want to try to raise interest rates to combat it. But they can't because they're still buying assets. And those two things are contradictory. You can't lower interest rates if you're still buying debt on a daily basis or monthly basis. You have to stop the asset purchases before you can do anything. And the problem is if the Fed stops buying all this debt, then we're dealing with a little bit more of a real economy, and reality will kick in. And that's going to be a troubling economic environment. So the Fed is stuck. At one point, it doesn't want to continue to pump money into the economy, creating a long-term problem. But at the same time, the minute it stops making those acquisitions, everybody's going to run for the hills. The bond market's going to tank, the stock market's going to go down, and we're going to be facing some real trouble. So, the Fed is at a point where it has to rewrite the book. It doesn't have a playbook. This is completely new territory, and Chairman Powell has freely admitted that. They're dealing in uncharted territory, and that unfortunately creates the opportunity for the Fed to make a huge mistake. And if they do, we could be facing a real economic hiccup. Plus, again, the government's running out of money. As if this wasn't all fun enough. We've hit the debt limit again. Janet Yellen was screaming that we have to deal with it, and it's almost become a joke. I went back to try to see how many times, but I got caught up. But how many times since even the year 2000 have we hit the debt limit? What has Congress done every time? So the debt limit, for those that don't know that, Congress does occasionally try to address the fact it spends money it doesn't have, and it sets itself a limit. It's like that gambler saying, okay, if I lose $10,000, I'll stop gambling. Well, then it gets to that $10,000 loss limit, and it says, well, okay, let's make it $15,000. So now I can spend another $5,000. And then it hits the $15,000 mark, and it does the same thing. It just continually raises the debt limit. Keeps pushing the goalpost farther back. So if it doesn't do that, then Congress is forced to take some hard actions. It has to stop spending the money it doesn't have at that point, which means it has to begin to shut down government services. It has to stop making payments out on debt instruments. It can't keep that up. The U.S. government has never defaulted on a debt obligation, and I don't believe it ever will. I mean, I shouldn't say ever, but it won't in the near future. It will print whatever amount of money it needs to deal with its debt problems. So the fact that we have these debt limits is, it's a little bit of nonsense. It's a little bit of kabuki theater, as they say, and they'll make a big to-do about it, but in the end, Congress folds like a cheap tent. It's like that gambler. It's like, I'm going to say to you, that's it, you're done. You can't spend any more. And you're like, well, but maybe just a little bit more? All right. If you allow me to spend a little bit more, I think I can win back.
I can win it back.
I can win it back. So let me spend more. It doesn't matter. I'll make it back. And it never happens.
For the folks out there, a lot of people are waking up to this and learning and being educated, which is awesome. And a lot of them, one of the more common questions I get, and I would love to get your take on it because you're in this every day, is if I have a 401k, if I have a workplace plan set up or a retirement type situation set up, and whether they have $5,000 or $2,000 or they have millions of dollars, I don't know. What is your solution for some of them in a situation like this where they want to get something done quick because they believe that there's things on the horizon, but at the same time, you don't want to dump it all over. You also want a tax burden. What is your advice to them typically?
Yeah, it's a tough position to be in. I talk to a lot of people that, the only savings they have were from 401ks or similar, instruments like that. And these retirement accounts are generally limited in what you can acquire. Like, for example, a 401k would not allow you to take money and buy gold or silver coin and take possession of it. They don't allow that. So with those limitations, people are concerned. Sometimes they're forced to, they have to buy stock with the money, or, that's all they can do with it. And they're not comfortable with it. And they're trying to diversify. Unfortunately, there's a very limited amount of things people can do except that reality that, the 401k is limited. And if you do want to have wealth protection, you may have to pull some money out. And a number of people have chosen to do that, even though they recognize there may be an initial tax liability. You got to look at it kind of like, I guess it's a one step backward to go 3 step forward sort of thing. You recognize that you're going to take a tax hit if you pull that money out, especially if you're not at retirement age. But the benefit is that a lot of people feel a lot better about themselves health-wise and their financial health by knowing that they've got something real in their hands, even though it cost them a little money to do it. I've talked to a lot of people about this all over a long period of time. No one has really ever looked back and said, well, I should not have done that.
Right.
The people that have done this properly, that have held it for a longer period of time, have benefited from doing it to the point where it was the smart play. Again, it's a tough, initial decision to make because, again, there's some cost involved. But I am a firm believer in diversifying, and I've always said it that way, that, if the only money that you have, if everything that you've saved is in a retirement account, I just find that to be a little bit problematic, because it means that whether you meant to or not, by default, you're relying on that market, that stock market, that U.S. dollar value to stay the same for your future, and your future depends on it. And I just don't believe a dollar's dependable. It's not. The only thing I can depend on is it's going to be worth less. It's just a question of how much. Is it going to lose 5%, 10% each year? How much is it going to be, trimmed? I think this is inevitable. And I think the situation's getting worse, and not only worse, but worse much more quickly.
No, it makes sense. It's even if there's a shift. I mean, how do you go back to? We've kind of discussed this in the past. If you had the shift, other than something out of left field, how would you go back to, for example, say a gold standard? I'm very hopeful. This is me. I'm very hopeful. How could you in a speedy way, and let's say speedy 5 to 10 years, like give it time, how would you find a way back to sound money at this point?
Okay, first thing is we stop borrowing money from the Federal Reserve. We let the United States Treasury print the money directly. Instead of borrowing from the Fed, paying interest to them, and allowing them to keep the seigniorage, which is the gap between the cost of printing and the face value, we let the U.S. Treasury directly print the money, which first of all cuts down the expense of it rather dramatically. That's step one. Step two, manage the U.S. Treasury Department and have Congress pass a federal law, just like they had before, that said, we're going to establish a constraint on money by tagging it to a real tangible asset. And going forward, they can simply say, listen, we're not going to print a dollar unless we can sustain that dollar with something supported by a real tangible, valuable asset. Gold and silver have always been that choice because other things are problematic. Gold and silver are a wonderful tool for that purpose. They're limited in their availability. There's a good supply of the stuff out there that could be utilized. And we could, again, tag the US dollar to a quantity of gold or silver, whatever that might turn out to be, even if it was like, 0.00001 ounces of gold for every dollar, whatever it would be, it would certainly be far better than just, print with nothing behind it. The problem is that would force a couple things very quickly. First of all, again, now, without the ability to print unlimited amounts of money, what does Congress do with its $31 trillion worth of debt? How does it deal with the fact that it spends money it doesn't have? So if they deficit spend with a gold standard, they've got a real problem. So it's going to force Congress to change its mentality. Instead of proposing a $3.5 trillion budget they can't pay for, you're going to have to actually sit down with a real accounting process and say, okay, we can do this because we can raise that money through taxes, or we can certainly justify this by what we're doing. And I just don't think Congress could pull it off. I just don't believe they can do it, which is why, as much as I am in favor of the idea and wholeheartedly believe it would be in the best interest of the general public, I just don't believe Congress would ever do it, because I don't think they could deal with the onslaught of having to deal with real money in real terms and not be able to, spend knowing that they had that backing behind them, without the enabler. Could Congress survive? I don't think the answer is yes. So, we could do it. It would just take a congressional law, but I don't think the Congress has, the guts to pull it off.
In a pie in the sky world, in theory, I'm trying to think how I would even word this. Could you kill off the Fed through bankruptcy and be out of that contract, considering we, the people, didn't technically buy into that contract? Does that make sense?
Yeah, the problem is Congress approved the Federal Reserve Act, so it was legally authorized through a congressional act. So we can't sort of default our way out of the problem. We're not going to turn around to the Federal Reserve and say, we owe $31 trillion worth of debt. We owe money in X, Y, and Z to the Federal Reserve, and that we're going to default and not make the payment back. I just don't see that as viable. Again, we don't have that control over our economy. The Fed is controlling the economy. It's sort of the other way around. they're really in the power position. The best way to control the Fed or to end it would be to let the Treasury Department issue money directly. In the 1960s, we had a small period of time where we printed what were known as United States notes. And they were different from Federal Reserve notes, visibly different in the fact that they had a red-colored seal, which is that little seal on the right side of a bill. If you ever looked at any kind of paper note, there's a green seal on every note that you have in your pocket. And at the top of every note you have in your pocket, it says Federal Reserve Note. But in the 1960s, late 50s and 60s, we printed U.S. notes, and this was money issued directly from the Treasury Department without being borrowed from the Federal Reserve and directly put into circulation. Yep, that one on the top right, that $2 with the red seal. The $5 looks like a Federal Reserve note. Yeah, there's a nice picture of a $2.
That's crazy.
So people are seeing what I'm seeing there. And if you read the top of that note, it says United States note. So what was different about that is that normally if we print a $2 note, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing prints the note, whatever it costs to print it, which is, 20 cents, 30 cents, whatever it costs to print a note. It takes the note at face value and gives it to the Federal Reserve Bank. Federal Reserve buys it and then loans it back to Congress at interest, and Congress pays the full face value. And the Fed keeps that gap between the cost and the printing. On these United States notes, the same premise applies, except Congress keeps the money. We don't distribute that seigniorage back to the Federal Reserve. It's kept in-house, which is the way money should be printed. And then we could be much more responsible. But Federal Reserve notes dictate control, and the Federal Reserve banks do not allow the U.S. notes to be printed anymore. They ended in 1963. We haven't printed one since. Kennedy was the last president to try to do that. And there were people that argue that might have been one of the reasons he was assassinated, is that, the pushback against the Federal Reserve was so dramatic. They wanted to see him gone. They didn't want a president who was pushing for a Treasury issuing money instead of the Fed. But it could be done. Congress would have to have some serious guts to take on the Fed. But it is certainly a possibility.
I've never really looked at those before. Now I got to go get some because they look so cool. That's pretty fascinating there. I mean, the sleight of hand or deception is amazing because, other than obviously us who study this or look at this, the average person is not going to see the difference in those.
And if they do, they may not understand the significance.
Right.
So, this has happened before. It goes back to the Civil War. Lincoln was faced with obligations to pay for the Civil War debts. And at the time, when interest rates were 3%, bankers offered him loans at 18 or 19% interest so that he could finance the war. And he said, well, I don't want to pay that much because what will happen is the war will end and the country will be so indebted, it'll take them decades to pay for this war. I don't want to be the one responsible for that. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to print money from the U.S. Treasury, and I'm going to circulate the first federal money that was issued in America was during the Civil War. Prior to that, we had, for the most part, state notes and individual bank notes because every bank could issue its own currency. States could issue their own currency, and people were comfortable with that. So Lincoln, faced with this monster amount of debt, decided instead of borrowing the money from the bankers and paying the exorbitant interest they wanted to charge, that he would print money. And we had the first what were called greenbacks. And the term greenback came from literally the color of the notes that Lincoln issued in 1861. And he circulated them directly into the economy, right from the Treasury Department. And again, he didn't survive his presidency, and that ended.
I can't imagine why.
Well, again, we can always make that argument that was there a relationship between the printing of money against the central bank or against the bankers' interests. Was that part of it? Again, there's interesting theories that have been espoused about that unusual sort of circumstance.
I'm full in on those theories.
Was it merely coincidence, or was it every president who tried to fight back against the Fed didn't survive his presidency? We've only had 4 president assassinations in American history, and in one way or the other, every one of them can be tied to something strange when it came to money policy. But anyway, that notwithstanding, the point being that we had tried in previous points in history to subvert borrowing money from bankers and utilizing the ability of the Treasury. But once the Civil War ended, that pretty much came to an end as well. And, we ended up with a central banking system that was a little bit more ingrained. States began to lose their authority to print money. We had a federalized system at that point. Part of the pushback from southern states, against the issues in the Civil War were the fact that the federal government for the first time was telling the state, you can't print your own money. You can no longer do that. You have to accept the federal money that we create, and we're going to take away your right to print your own. And a lot of the southern states took offense to that and said, well, that means we have to trust a federal government's issued currency. We would rather trust our local bank. We have more control. But they didn't have a choice, and that was something that was force-fed to the southern states. Eventually, again, they yielded. They lost the war, and we ended up with a federalized money system that perpetrated a big problem that persisted going forward into the Industrial Revolution, and it eventually, I would say, concluded, with the 1907 money panic that led to the creation of the National Monetary Commission, which led to the Federal Reserve in 1913. So that advent, and we could talk about that, we could go on for that for about an hour, but that little bit of history between 1861 and 1913 is enormous in terms of the changes in monetary policy. But the end result is we consolidated the printing of money, and it became, just like the industries around the country did during that period. You had a consolidation of the steel industry. You had a consolidation of the oil industry. You had a consolidation of the railroad industry. All of those ended up in very few hands that controlled the overall market. Same thing happened with money. It ended up getting really solidly controlled by a handful of the major New York banks that ended up controlling the entire economy. And again, supported this Federal Reserve Act that was passed by Congress in January 1914. December 1913 is when the law was written and passed by Congress. And again, it started in 1914. And since then, the job of the Federal Reserve was to sustain the value of money and maintain good employment in numbers in the United States. And if you look at the value of the dollar in 1914 and compare it to today in 2021, we've lost about 97.5%, 98% of the value of the dollar. So that's how the Federal Reserve has done. It was chartered with this job of sustaining the value of a dollar, and it lost 98% of its value. So it's like
cut him. He is frozen on my end. Well, we are coming to the end of the 2 hours anyway. So, Fred, if you can hear me, I will talk to you soon, and I will cut you now, and I will wrap up with a promo for you, and then we're going to dive into that time period he just talked about that I don't know a lot about. I have to go study. I'm going to go study that, and when he comes back next time, we're going to go over all of that. So, Fred, I will be in touch. Thank you for being on today. I will promo you now when I cut your frozen picture off. Hold on. Okay. So, that was Fred Dashevsky. He was finishing up. Oh, here he is. Let me see if I can get him back. Nope, he is he is off. So, with Fred, so do me a favor. We will catch up again later with more information, and I'm going to bring him back for that part as well, because I want to talk about that, the 1800s to the early 1900s and how that affected. So I'm just going to go here, and I'm going to promote him because his information is impeccable, and he's the only one that I use for my gold and silver. And here is uscoincapital.com. It's uscoin, uscoincapital.com. All right, and the number is 800-878-2646. Again, 800-878-2646. His work is amazing, and again, I'm going to promote him because he's the only one I use. These bullion coins I had prior to it because I wanted to see what they look like. Everything else I get from Fred, pre-64s, and then I get my numismatics as well. And it has been a great thing to deal with. Your packages come packed in Fort Knox like shipments, but if you have not bought from Fred, I'm not going to tell you how it's Fort Knox like. I'll just let you know it's like Fort Knox. You will tell me I am right when you get your package if you've never gotten from him before. And we invest heavily in him for all of our investment needs, and he is fantastic. So Fred, a real quick story before we go. I listened to Fred and his past partner, Andrew Gauss. Andrew has passed away, and they didn't break up the partnership. He passed, and Fred went on with his own, with US Coin Capital. And I used to listen to Andrew for years. The last 10 years, I listened to Andrew on a great podcast called OneRadioNetwork.com with Patrick Tipone, also a great podcast. Talks about health, finance, etc. And that's where I listened every single week, like religiously every single week, before I'd ever gotten involved. And the reason why I use them is because it's an education. It is not someone selling you a coin. It is not someone selling you anything. Literally, if you call and he doesn't feel like it's in your best interest to invest in it, maybe finances or something like that, he's going to tell you. It's not just hey, get somebody on the call for a sales check. No, it's an investment. It's wanting to know your background, what are you in, what kind of money do you have, etc., different things like that, and getting you to your goals for how you want your future. That is so important. So uscoincapital.com. And again, the phone number 800-878-2646. I'm starting to remember that number as well as my office number. So, folks, thank you for hanging out for today's show. I have to run. We did a solid 2 hours. Share this to everybody. Let people know what is happening in our world, and let people know how we can best help them.